Hi ho, how's everybody doing today? Welcome back to class for week 7, lecture 7A. Hope you all had a great weekend. You know, we are almost halfway through this semester. Once you get halfway through this semester, it's like swimming a lap at the pool. Once you touch the other side, you might as well just finish it out because you're closer to the end than you were to the beginning. All right. I got my coffee here, probably drinking too much coffee. This is about my 5th cup of coffee for the day. Been sitting here in the studio on South Campus. How are y'all doing? Check in if you would. Say hello online. Either type in the chat bar or send me a text. Let me know you're still there. What'd everybody do this weekend? I umpired baseball on Sunday and saw the weirdest play I have seen in a long time in baseball. Oh, Xiaoyuan is there. She's checking in on Remind. Hello, it's very good to see you. I hope you had a great weekend. All right. Well, it looks like the rest of you are going to be a little shy online. At any rate, I think we have Erica here, we have Michaela here, and we also have Andre Williams here. Good to see everybody. All right, so today is Chapter 7. If you remember, I've been telling you about the way this class is organized. Chapter 7 actually combines physical and cognitive development. Remember, we talked about the 3 domains of development. So Chapter 7 is going to be physical and cognitive development, all right? And it's going to relate to physical and cognitive development in early childhood. Chapter 8, we're going to do socio-emotional development in early childhood. So chapters 7 and chapters 8 are related to the period of development known as early childhood. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk a little bit about the physical, the growth expectations during early childhood, growth hormone deficiency syndrome, and we're going to talk a little bit about how the brain and nervous system changes in this period. We're going to hit myelination and blooming and pruning again, and then we're going to go in depth in description of Piaget's second stage of cognitive development, the pre-operational period, and talk a little bit about conservation tasks. And then I'm going to contrast him with a Russian psychologist who also had a theory of human development known as Lev Vygotsky. So we're going to contrast and compare Vygotskyan theory of development with Piagetian theory of development. And I'm going to introduce you to some Vygotskyan terms, the zone of proximal development and scaffolding. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So remember, welcome to early childhood. We're going to be talking about that age between 2 years to 5 years. If you think about it socially and sort of in terms of what's happening developmentally, it's that time between when you begin sort of talking in a productive manner and walking in a productive manner. So toddlerhood all the way to when you're ready to be formally educated. And if you take a look at the pictures down here in the corner of this screen, you see the 2-year-old picture of a penguin. And you see the 5-year-old picture of Christmas. You can tell that quite a bit has happened between the age of 2 years and the age of 5 years. Looks like we've got a new attendee, whoever's here live. Thank you for showing up. Welcome to class. We're talking a little bit about physical and cognitive development in early childhood. So let's talk a little bit about the physical development. Child's going to average about 2.5 inches and 5 to 10 pounds per year during early childhood. So your kid's really going to grow up from 2 to 5 and turn from a little baby into a little person. The growth patterns do vary individually, but during this age, boys are going to be a little bit bigger and taller than girls at this period. Now, when we get to middle and late childhood, when puberty begins hitting girls, we're going to reverse that process. But right now, your little boys are going to be bigger than little girls. Two most important contributors to height differences, as described by your book. They call it ethnicity, but I think of it as culture and ethnicity. Basically, you're going to see taller and bigger kids in urban areas, upper middle class populations, and with firstborn children. So you're going to see urban, upper middle class firstborns are going to be the biggest children, and it sort of varies going down. Also, you're going to see that your African American children are going to be bigger than your Caucasian, white, non-Latino children. And we're going to talk a little bit later about nutrition and how that is important too. But nutrition is also another good predictor of height and weight. Some children are born with a growth hormone deficiency, which is the absence of a growth hormone produced by the pituitary gland to stimulate the body to grow. Without this kind of hormone therapy, children will not reach 5 foot tall. Now, it turns out that if you do take a regimen for 4 years, starting at the age of 2, it does work, and you can get children who will approach adult height. Now, boys are twice as likely to take hormone therapy when they're small because of the social stigma, especially that exists for boys who are small. It turns out that being a little bit taller is going to improve the self-esteem. As a 5'6" guy, I was always the smallest fellow growing up, and I remember always having a sense of inferiority because my bigger brethren were out there making me feel inferior. I don't know if any of you students in class right now were taller than me. I mean, even the girls were taller than me in kindergarten. It was horrible being the smallest kid. Okay, so that's sort of the height and growth expectations that you're going to see in children during this period. Now, what's the neurological development that's occurring? Remember, we're going to talk about myelination and blooming and pruning again. Now, let's talk about the brain size. Brains are born extremely big, and this is why children have trouble holding their head up and trouble moving during the first couple of years of life. This head is so outsized compared to the rest of the body, and it's because your brain wants to get as many things that Mother Nature, that evolution wanted to put as many brain circuits in that brain as possible. So your brain's born with all of these immature brain systems that when they fully flower are going to give you tons of conscious and other intellectual abilities that are going to help you be so clever as an adult. All right. So your brain's going to slow down growing. It's going to grow faster than the rest of your body. It's not going to grow as fast as it did the first year, but it is going to be growing bigger than the rest of your body. And your brain is going to have its adult 75% of its adult volume by 3 years and almost fully grown by the age of 6 years. And if you'll notice, your little kindergartners sort of have big heads compared to us adults. Where I notice it most is in Pee-wee football, because you'll see basically Pee-wee football looks like these big helmets running around with teeny little legs coming out of the bottom of them. So your head is going to be almost fully grown at the age of 6 years. And if you think about it, you are nowhere close to being physically mature at that age. Now, there's going to be very little growth in the brain after 3 years, but there is going to be significant change in the brain. Some areas and circuits are going to experience huge growth followed by huge losses of neural tissue as they mature into their final pathway. So your brain's not going to be growing and bigger, but it's going to be changing and creating its own architecture during this period created by the blooming and pruning and this idea of neuroplasticity, or change in the brain based on experience. Now, you're going to see that most of your rapid growth is going to occur in the frontal lobe from ages 3 to 6. That's going to be the part of the brain that's going to be reorganizing and growing the fastest. during the 3 to 6 year period. And what you're going to notice is that period, the child's going to go from somebody that can't focus at all to somebody who is school ready. Now, there are some children who get pushed into school at the age of 5. And the thing is, not all children are neurologically ready for school at age 5. Some people do their kids a disservice if they push them into school too early. Nobody said you had to start formal schooling at 4.5 or 5. Some kids aren't ready till 6. And so really, it depends. There are a whole host of factors which determine how well you do in school. Your ability to sit down and pay attention, your ability to use your hands and fingers, your perceptual abilities. There are a lot of things besides intellect that predict school readiness. And so really, one of the things you need to be aware of is that it's not time to send your kid to school until their frontal lobe begins to myelinate and they really start to develop these attentional abilities. Right? Now, if you look over here diagonally down here below the comments, you'll see the synaptic density in different areas of the brain, and you can see sort of how they mature. And what you'll see is your visual cortex and your senses and your primary motor areas are going to experience blooming and pruning, which is sort of the synaptic maturity of these areas, before you're going to see the maturity in the frontal lobe. So brains sort of mature at different, brain parts mature at different speeds depending upon how primarily important they are. So your vision center comes online much quicker than your ability to pay attention, right? Now, right below me, you see a crosscut of a myelinated axon. So the white part in the middle is the axon coming right at you. And you should be able to see the concentric rings of myelin that are around that axon. These are composed of glial cells which myelinate or insulate your axons. And myelination is going to be something that affects your brain's ability to function as well. And as you'll see some comments down below, myelination of areas related to hand-eye coordination are not going to be complete until age 4. So your kids at 3, they're going to be able to use their hands and do this fine pincer grasp, but they're not going to be smooth as the older children because they still don't quite have this hand-eye coordination that's going to develop just a little bit later in 5 or 6, and that's when pee-wee sports will start, right? Now, your book does suggest that increased myelination at age 3 is related to improved cognitive skills. So not only does this myelination affect your physical skills, but it also affects your cognitive abilities as well. So as areas myelinate and the blooming and pruning matures, you get these the blooming of the synaptic density, and then more importantly, it's the pruning that sort of represents sort of the final maturation of the brain area. As this blooming and pruning and myelination occurs, these different parts of the brain are going to mature and come online. And so your vision's going to come online early, your ability to move your body and feel your body and perceive things a little bit earlier. But your ability to pay attention, your ability to remember things, and your fine motor control is going to take a little bit later to mature because these systems aren't fully, neurologically mature. Motor development. So, you know what? Little kids at the age of 2 to 5 are some of the most exhausting human beings you will ever see. They are all over the place, man. And you have really got to be on your game if you're a parent. Now, if you've only got 2 kids, you can still guard them man to man. But when you move to 3 children, you've got to come up with a zone defense if you want to keep those kids in check when you're around the house, man. It can be difficult, but because they have such incredible energy. Now, I'd like to differentiate between fine motor skills and gross motor skills. Remember, we talked about a couple of chapters ago this idea of proximodistal development. The fact that the bigger muscles in the core of your body tend to mature, and the motor movements associated with them tend to mature quicker than the fine motor movements like pincer grasp does. That's the proximodistal principle. And so motor movements are going to be any motor skills that involve core muscles, big muscles, lifting your arms, walking, turning your core, lifting your head. Fine motor skills are going to be those things that you use for your fingers, for your lips, and maybe, I guess, for your toes, those little small motor movements. Now, what you're going to see at this age is that kids at age 3, they're going to have this pincer grasp, which is developmentally crucial. You don't know how important this is at age 3, but it's still not going to be finely developed. It's going to begin developing, but if you think about it, that's why in kindergarten you use the fat pencil, because you still haven't worked out this fine motor skill that you need for pencils. Now, when they do developmental evaluations of children who are struggling in school, they don't only look at mental abilities, cognitive functioning, but they also look at fine motor skills. They also look at attention skills. They also look at perceptual skills, because your ability to see things, your ability to write, your ability to move, and your ability to pay attention are all different factors that can affect your performance in school. So the fact that we have these fine motor skills and they're still developing is important in terms of whether or not your child is ready for school. Can they pay attention, and do they have these fine motor skills? If your child has a delay at this point, 2, 3 years old, you might be able to come in and do some sort of intervention to prepare your kid to be successful when they get to school. The body coordination. Kids are going to begin to become athletes around age 5. You're going to start to see, well, they'll be able to play sports and coordinate their body abilities to be useful at some sort of sporting activity. Gross motor skills, simple motor movements at 4. They're more adventurous at 3, they're more adventurous at 4, and by 5 you have daredevils on your hand. Now, I do want to point down at the bottom of your screen here, you will see what is the leading cause of death in early childhood? Accidents. You need to be careful. Look at this young man here trying to turn on the TV. He's learned how to turn on the TV long before he's understood the sense of pulling a TV over on you. This kid is in prime situation to have a bad accident. If you'll see here diagonally, this is a toy that existed in the 70s called jarts. Those are steel-tipped darts that you would throw in your yard. You're supposed to put those rings out there and play like ring toss, but with metal darts. Can you imagine having toys like that around your house for your little 6 and 7-year-olds to throw while your little 3-year-old was running around? Jarts. Accidents. Number 1 killer of kids your age, and you have to be careful that their gross motor abilities and their sense of adventurousness doesn't put them into situations where they can hurt themselves. Now, one of the things that I do have in your course resources folder this week that you might find interesting is a 60-minute story about one man's crusade to have these things called jarts banned by the United States government. He did this in the late 80s after his little 4-year-old girl was killed by a jart hitting her in the head. And it's a real interesting story about how one man changed toy policy in the United States. It's an interesting and sad story you might want to look at. Now, just for a side note, other than the fact that your child has accidents, early childhood is the safest time in your kid's life. Look at this little graph. You'll see from 0 to 1 year, your child has quite a likelihood of dying during the first year. That first year is really dangerous. But after we get through those congenital problems, those problems at development and prenatal during the prenatal period, once we get through that first year, early childhood is actually the safest time of your life, with the exception of accidents. And that's why we put the little plastic plugs in the light sockets. That's why we put the little locks on the kitchen cabinets and the toilets, because accidents are really the only thing your child has to worry about at this point. And if you want to look at this graph, you will notice that males are more likely to die at almost every age of life, except old age, and by then we've lost so many that the females that are left are going to begin dying. I'm not sure exactly what that is. I don't know if it's testosterone or culture, but it is a consistent finding. Okay, sleep and nutrition, very important at this time. Your kids should be sleeping during the night. If you'll remember from a couple of chapters ago, I showed you the sleep pictograph, the sleep graph, showing how random sleeping was during the first 6 months of life. And then you noticed about the first year of life, your child started sleeping through the night and demonstrating sort of a morning and an afternoon nap. And that's going to be the pattern during the first 2 years. From year 2 to 3, your child's going to be sleeping through the night and probably only taking one nap during the day. I'm a 51-year-old professor, and you know what? I think taking naps in the afternoon are the most fabulous thing you can do. I highly recommend it after the age of 3, although you're going to find your kids aren't wanting to take their afternoon nap starting after about 2.5 or 3. The child should sleep 11 to 13 hours a day if possible. When you are sleeping, your brain is being cleaned of all the proteins and small molecules that are created by a hard-thinking brain during the day. And also you are practicing solidifying neural connections and enhancing synaptic growth while you're sleeping. So it is very important to get your child to sleep as much as possible during the night, 11 to 13 hours. And you know what? As a parent, you will find that you enjoy the extra time that your child spends working on their neurological development too. Now, sleep problems or lack of sleep. Your book talks about the problems associated with lack of sleep, and it turns out that lack of sleep or inability to get to sleep may be related to the amount of screen time that your child has. So a lot of kids at 2 and 3 are playing on iPads and playing with little iPhones and watching TV and whatnot. The more screen time you have, the more likely your child is to have screen problems. And sleep problems or lack of sleep is associated with worse school readiness. Your kid's going to be cranky and going to have trouble getting along with their friends, so poor peer acceptance and social skills. And you know what? They're not going to be as active or invigorated during the day, and you're going to have a higher incidence of having an overweight child. So you really want to make sure they get to sleep so they can learn at school, get along at school, and exercise enough to stay healthy. Children around this age need about 1,300 calories a day, but most of us are doing a terrible, terrible, terrible job at feeding our children. We've become a fast food world where it's easier to go buy a bagged meal than it is to go home and cook a meal where you have to chop and cut up fresh vegetables, etc., etc. Now, when I grew up, this was in the 70s, before people had the money really to spend every meal on fast food. It just wasn't what we did back then. We ate at home every day. And I remember my mom was a 4-food group Nazi. Had to have your vegetables, had to have your fruits, had to have your meats and cheese, and you had to have your carbohydrates at every meal. Always fresh vegetables. And you know what? It was kind of nice sitting around the kitchen table with mom and dad and enjoying the family meals. So there was a social aspect of it too, but most importantly, I developed really good eating habits during that time. And you develop your eating habits from your parents. And so you as a parent, when your kid is a toddler, 2, 3, and 4, I can't tell you how important it is for you to develop some habits of eating vegetables, of eating healthy, of eating around the table, and not spending all their time eating out of a McDonald's or a Wendy's bag. Now, I carried these habits into my adulthood, and my wife, she was brought up, her mom was a single mom and didn't quite have the same attention to detail when it came to cooking as my mom did. So when we got married and had kids, I kind of had to coach her into eating those healthy meals and taking the extra time to cook those healthy meals. And in 27 years, she's gotten actually quite good at being a great cook too. So we both share the cooking duties. And we eat at the dinner table with our teenage sons probably 5 to 6 nights a week. Again, it's a great time to talk and fellowship and build that relationship. But more importantly, I'm shoving fresh vegetables down my kids' throat every night and cooking them fresh fish and eating them good carbohydrates instead of fried foods. And it really is going to develop. Now, right now, they're at their teenage age where they're eating out a lot too. But I guarantee you, when they become adults and have families and start bringing their kids up, they're going to gravitate back to these good eating habits that I developed in them. So you should try to develop those good eating habits in your children too. All right. Now, 93% of all fast food options contain 430 calories, which is almost a third of the calories your kid needs. Holy cow. And most children say that the vegetable they eat the most is French fried or fried potatoes. Horrible, horrible, horrible. And you know what? If you're overweight at 5, you're 4 times more likely to be overweight at 14. And I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad, but there are health risks associated with being overweight and inactive. And you know what? Your kids should be engaged in physical activity at least 3 hours a day. This was a lot easier in my day before video games and the internet were invented. Now you have to be a more motivated parent to make sure that your kids get that kind of activity. Exactly, because fries are easy to cook and they're tasty. So Araya is saying that in her high school, fries was always an option. You know what? That's what the kids will eat. You've been eating fries since you were 2 years of age. If I throw some fresh broccoli up there at you, you're going to throw that away because you're not accustomed to eating that. So I don't blame the schools as much as I just think that they're cooking things that I think you're going to eat. Nobody wants the baked chicken. They want hamburgers and hot dogs and the fried chicken sandwich. Now let's talk briefly about Jean Piaget. I spent too much time talking about physical development. Let's talk a little bit about cognitive development. During this period from the age 2 to 5, we are in the pre-operational period. Now remember, he argued that an operation was a reversible mental action, that a human could do a logical interaction. So if you know that 5 plus 4 equals 9, then you have the ability to reverse that operation. And if I ask you 9 minus 5, you'll be able to say 4. So an operation is a logical piece of logical reasoning that you can do forward and backward. And he argued that kids from 2 to around the age of 7 are in the pre-operational period. Now, when we talk about early childhood, we're talking about the early part of the pre-operational period, but let's just talk about from 2 to 7 as a whole, right? Now, he argued that children represent the world with words, images, and drawings. They can form concepts. They know what a fireman does and the objects that a fireman might have, or a fire person. They probably have gender stereotypes right now. So in a sense, they have the ability for symbolic representation, but their thinking sometimes demonstrates illogical properties. They're not good thinkers. Their thinking tends to be dominated by egocentrism. That is the ability to understand other people's perspectives. We'll talk about that on Thursday a little more. And sort of these magical beliefs, the idea that the sun goes to sleep at night, the idea that the sky rains, waters the trees intentionally. They have sort of these illogical, weird beliefs, kind of like a belief in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy, right? So they have these illogical beliefs, and they have the difficulty of changing perspectives. They get centered on one point of view, and it's hard for them. Again, just like they're egocentric in their thinking, they don't have the ability to look at a problem from multiple angles. So they're just not thinking, they're thinking symbolically, but not as logical as they could. Now, he argued that there's sort of these two stages, because you might say, wow, you can't tell me that kids can't think logically at age 6. You are right. He argued that you can think about it as sort of being broken down into two substages. From about 2 to 3, kids really are, they're not going to pass any of the logical tests that you really put on them, any of these centration tests that I'm going to talk to you about in a few minutes. So really, they're quite egocentric in their thinking. They don't have the ability to lose their perspective really at all. And again, they have these real illogical, surreal kind of beliefs about Santa Claus, about their stuffed animals being alive. So they have sort of these really illogical beliefs, and that's sort of the symbolic substage. And then he argues that children begin to figure it out, but they're not really sure. They're developing the rudiments of logical thinking, but they're not great with them yet. So you'll see logical abilities come and go. And he actually had several logical tasks that he would demonstrate with children, and he found that some of these tasks could be mastered before other tasks were. And he referred to this idea of picking up the different logical abilities in different areas as a horizontal decollage, which was just, in my opinion, another way of saying it's kind of messy, and I'm not sure exactly how the ordering goes. All right. Now, the thing that he used was a cool experiment called the conservation task. If you'll go to your weekly resources folder, along with the video about JARTs, I have a short 2-minute video showing children, both pre-operational and concrete operational children, engaging in what they call conservational tasks. And a conservational task just asks, does the child understand that an object stays the same even if it looks different? So is there some conservation of an underlying property? So for example, if I have 2 rows of quarters, and there are 5 quarters in each row. If I extend one row out and make it 3 inches longer, but it still has 5 quarters, does the child understand that the number of quarters hasn't changed? That's being able to conserve number. If I take 2 balls of clay that are in the same exact size, and I roll one out into a really long hot dog shape, even though it looks longer, does the child still understand that we have the same amount of clay, even though it looks different? And there's volume as well, which I don't have described here, but it's in the picture. If I take 2 glasses, glass A and B, that have the same amount of water, and I pour glass B into a taller glass C, does the child understand that I still have the same amount of water, even though it's in a taller glass? These are all conservation tasks. And what Piaget found was that children at the age of 2 or 3 were always fooled by these tasks. They couldn't conserve matter, number, length, or volume. But he found during the intuitive substage, 5, 6, and 7, children began to figure these tasks out. Now, I've provided a 2-minute video showing you these kids practicing some of these conservation tasks, and I think it would be very interesting for you to take the time to watch this short video to kind of get a feel for what this process is actually like. Okay? And your book's going to sort of have an infographic that sort of shows you what this task does and what the child's answer is. If you don't watch the video, this graph will work as a less interesting demonstration of what these conservation tasks were like. All right, now we're gonna contrast Piaget with Lev Vygotsky, because according to Piaget, social interaction really didn't matter. It was the kid interacting with the world that mattered, and not necessarily the social interaction. So Piaget, while they did interact with a caregiver, Piaget was really more interested in sort of the maturation of these processes as the kid interacted with the environment. Furthermore, Piaget didn't really think much about what you might call private speech. I don't know if you've ever seen a 2 or 3-year-old play, but all they do is talk to themselves while they're playing. They sort of have this internal monologue that they're talking to themselves. Piaget thought that was immature and didn't really mean anything and wasn't of developmental significance. On the other hand, Lev Vygotsky thought that was really, really important. So, whereas Piaget was more of a maturational biologist, Lev Vygotsky was a social constructivist. Whereas Piaget didn't think much about the importance of toddler language, Lev Vygotsky thought that was very important. And so Lev Vygotsky sort of had a different take on what was happening during this age. Lev didn't really have stages either. He instead imagined the child interacting in an environment in which they would then be mentored through and supported by a caregiver, an older adult, a teacher. So whereas Piaget was thinking about stages, Lev Vygotsky was thinking more about the relationship between the teacher and the learner. Your mom is your first teacher, your dad is your first teacher, your babysitter is your first teacher, your older brother, your older sister. They're all teachers that can help, that are part of this socially constructive process. In fact, really, I've got a video that sort of goes over the basics of Vygotsky's theory in course resources as well. And Lev Vygotsky thought really all we have is attention, perceptual ability, and memory. These are our 3 cognitive processes. Everything else that is knowledge is socially constructed. We talk about objects that are in our culture. We learn about things that are in our culture. We learn from people interacting with these tools and objects. So he thought that everything was socially constructed. Now, when it comes to language, we'll talk about that first. Where Piaget didn't think much about language, Lev Vygotsky thought that language actually represented the beginnings of thought. So I don't know if you've ever been in a hard problem before, but sometimes you probably talk through a problem. Have any of you ever talked through a problem out loud to yourself? If you have, type in the chat bar so I can see that. Sometimes I do that when I'm really, really struggling with something. He argued that toddlers and 3-year-olds talking to themselves was actually their first beginning attempts at thinking. And he argued that this actually showed the beginnings of thinking on the outside. And he argued that as the child matured, that external language moved inside and became compressed and formed the beginnings of thought. So whereas Piaget discounted that internal thought, Lev Vygotsky thought that actually represented the beginnings of intellectual thinking, if you will. And he argued that more private speech, talking to yourself, allowing you to work through these social interactions, increased a child's social competence and ability to learn more. Now, the 2 concepts that are really took off with Lev Vygotsky is this idea of zone of proximal development and scaffolding. Now, Lev Vygotsky was not a big fan of standardized tests because a standardized test measures what a kid can do completely on their own. But you know what? What if Johnny is super, super smart, and if you gave Johnny one hint, he could solve that super hard problem? Let's say Johnny and Mac, let's say Jane and Matilda, both score on the 4-year-old intellectual problem, right? But with one hint, Janie could do what a 7-year-old could do, and Matilda could only do what a 5-year-old could do. You might say that Janie is actually more developed than Matilda because with one little hint, she could really, really improve her performance. So think about the zone of proximal development as being some potentiality that exists in every kid, going from what you could do easily without any help at all to what you could do with just a little bit of help. All right. So whereas all standardized tests measure the beginning of the zone of proximal development, what they fail to miss is the potential development that you could have as a human being if you were put in the right social situation where somebody could mentor your abilities. Do you understand what I'm talking about with regard to zone of proximal development? He thought it was more important not to think about what a kid could do without any help, but to think about the potential that existed within that kid at that particular moment. And he argued that really what we should focus on was creating a social environment where a more experienced person, a teacher, if you will, could scaffold the behavior. And by scaffolding, he meant provide just enough support to help the child develop those abilities at the top end of their scale. Now, if you think about it, Piaget sort of said development occurs and that creates learning. All right? So once you develop these abilities, you will then learn these tasks. On the other hand, Vygotsky sort of suggested it's the learning that pulls the development along. So really what you need to do is focus on teaching the kid and focus on learning, and that pulls the development along, rather than Piaget saying the development pushes the learning along. I hope that distinction makes sense to you. Okay, now, Vygotsky in the classroom. How could you use Vygotskyan ideas to make your classroom better? Instead of giving your kid a standardized test, find out individually what each kid could do with a little bit of help. Yes, Johnny reads on a 4th grade level, but if I gave Johnny just a little bit of help on the hard words, could he read at the 7th grade level? Maybe Amy does science as well as a 7-year-old. But you know what? If I gave her just a little bit of help, could she perform at a 9-year-old level? So instead of thinking about kids as just a test number in unaided environments, see what the kid can do if you give them just a little bit of mentoring. And then you know what? Use that process. Find out environments, create environments where the kid can be challenged at the top level of their ability, and create caregiver and put them with teachers that can help them scaffold those tasks when they're at the top of their ZPD. Now you might say, holy cow, Chris, I'm only one teacher. How can I serve as a mentor and a teacher to 29 kids in my environment, helping each one of them at the top of their ZPD? Well, Vygotsky would suggest that everybody who knows more than another person can become a mentor, a teacher. So use more skilled peers as the teachers. So what you've got in Vygotsky's idea is looking at kids' potentials and utilizing everybody in the classroom's abilities to help structure, scaffold, and pull everybody's learning along. So Vygotsky really focused on the social environment more than he did some sort of maturational model where a kid's mind is evolving through stages. Now, just like Piaget, Vygotsky was not very specific enough about age-related changes. He didn't talk about those kinds of specific abilities that the information processing people did in the baby human to think, right? And he also seemed to really focus on language in terms of being the precursor to cognitive development. But what about people who have language disorders? They still learn how to think. So we have to decouple the concepts of thinking and language a little more than Vygotsky was willing to. Now, Vygotsky didn't get to finish out his great ideas because he died of tuberculosis at the young age of 37. But even dying at 37, he represents one of the 3 Russian rock stars in the field of developmental psychology, along with Ivan Pavlov, the developer of classical conditioning, who mentored him, and Isaac Luria, his student, who would become very famous in the area of memory. And so these are three huge rock stars, all related to one another, that I think are very interesting to talk about. Now, right before he died, Lev Vygotsky penned this iconic quote: "I hope that I'm as elegant and composed as he was at the time of my death. This is the final thing I've done in psychology, and I will, like Moses, die at the summit, having glimpsed the promised land, but without setting foot on it. Farewell, dear creation, the rest is silence." Holy cow, if he hadn't been a developmental psychologist, he could have been a poet, huh? Okay, so your book's going to have this little chart. It's in color, and the color didn't transfer to this PowerPoint presentation. But this chart goes through and sort of characterizes the difference between Vygotsky's theory of development and Piaget's theory of development. On the homework, on the exam, I reserve the right to ask you about the differences between these two theories of intellectual development. All right. That's the end of Chapter 7A lecture. Does anybody have any questions? I want to thank all 8 of you for staying through the entire lecture. You are a great motivated class, and I just can't tell you how impressed I am with your focus here this semester. Everybody coming to Wednesday webinar? I hope I'll see you in Wednesday webinar. Oh, before I let you go, the video, I know the video I'm asking you to watch is really, really long. You do not have to watch the whole hour and a half, but it is a horrifying hour and a half showing what happens to children when they're neglected and not given stimulation early in childhood. And we're going to talk about the value of stimulation for thriving in neurological and physiological development in early childhood. So I would like for you to watch, and if you have to skip from part to part, I would just like for you to watch some of these young children that they follow as they discover the conditions in this Bulgarian orphanage. And then on Wednesday, I will show you some short videos of after the intervention that was performed at this particular orphanage. Okay. Is there a good reason that Lev Vygotsky's ideas did not take hold in the educational system? That is a great question from Arya, and I would say that it might be 2 reasons. Number one, his theory is pretty time intensive, and it doesn't work well in a machine, which is the American Eastern or the American Western educational system, right? We are educating people like a machine. This is a very holistic, individual type of philosophy that you're probably going to see in some of your more expensive charter schools and your Montessori schools. That would be the one reason why, Arya. And the second reason is because he was Russian, right? And if you'll remember from the 30s through the 60s, the United States, the Eastern part of the Western allies and the Eastern European allies, Eastern Europeans did not see eye to eye, and we did not trade information academically or research-wise, and there was political differences actually really created this gulf where we didn't learn much about Russian psychologists were doing in the early half of the 20th century. And Isaac Luria, you have never heard of him because they don't talk about him at all, hardly, in American textbooks, although he was a giant in the early history of the neurobiology of memory. And Michaela's laughing. You know, it's kind of ridiculous how politics does affect things like science. There is no science without a historical context. All right, folks, I have kept you for 48 minutes. I do apologize for that delay. I hope to see you in class tomorrow tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock when we talk about the importance of early childhood care. Take care, and I will see you tomorrow.